The night we killed our daughter is one that would be forever branded in my mind. Each night afterward, as I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, I would replay those events over and over, reliving the darkest, most shameful moment of my life. I would remember the weight of Sarah's lifeless body in my arms, the weight of my own heart, as I carried her from the car, and I would silently weep. Hannah and I needed months of careful planning before we could make our move, which proved especially difficult because we couldn't even think about what we were going to do, lest Sarah discover our secrets. Every morning as I drove to work, I would finally get the chance to think about how I would take my daughter's life. Every evening as I drove home, I would work to push those thoughts from my brain and replace them with thoughts of how work went, or whatever songs were on the radio. It was especially difficult to plan with Hannah because she was around Sarah more, and I knew she struggled more than I did when it came to keeping secrets from her. We couldn't talk about it unless we were out of the house together, which happened very seldom for fear of what Sarah might do if left to her own devices. It was around that time that Hannah started singing. She always hummed to herself while she did the dishes or folded the laundry, but lately it had seemed like every breath she took was one of song. It was beginning to get annoying, because she always sang the same 3 songs. Over and over, it was either What I Like About You, Every Rose Has Its Thorn, or Talk Dirty to Me. It got to a point where I found myself singing these songs too, whenever I was in the shower or driving in the car. It was during one of these morning commutes, singing about a cowboy's sad, sad song, that I just couldn't get out of my head, when it finally hit me. Poison. One of the most surefire ways Hannah had been able to keep Sarah out of her mind was by keeping a song stuck in her head. I'd assumed that had been why she'd started singing more, but I hadn't noticed until that moment that all 3 songs were by an 80s band called Poison, a group I knew Hannah didn't listen to. That night when I got home, I put my theory to the test by singing a Lou Rawlings song my mother used to play. We understand each other. Hannah didn't know the song, but the moment I got to the chorus, her eyes snapped up so quickly, I thought she had certainly given herself away. I quickly glanced at Sarah, careful to keep my mind on the song. She was sitting quietly on the couch, staring through the window into the night sky. She did that more and more often these days, like she was somewhere else entirely. She would spend hours in such a position, staring at nothing but the blank space between her face and the window. I'd often wondered how cognizant she really was of her surroundings, but didn't dare allow myself to think she was anything less than completely aware. It was through that method that Hannah and I hatched our plan. It was early spring. The days had finally begun to get longer, but that day felt like the longest of all. I went to work, Sarah to school, and Hannah spent the day running errands. Hannah and I met for lunch at a diner around the corner from my office. I ordered the tomato soup and BLT, and Hannah had the tuna melt. We talked about the grocery list and Sarah's upcoming math test, putting on a show for anyone that might remember us later, although there were very few people in the diner that afternoon, and fewer still that might be within earshot. That was particularly why I'd chosen that diner. The other part was because I knew the security camera in the corner wasn't working, so there should be no record of Hannah carefully sliding a small envelope across the table, concealed by her palm. The envelope contained a white powder I understood to be midazolam, a potent sedative. As it turned out, the neighbour Hannah had gone to see while I spoke with Bob, Tammy Howell, had a nurse friend with low morals who had been able to procure a pill here and there for Tommy when she asked. It had only taken a phone call and a couple weeks before the drug was in our possession. I'd been hoping for something stronger, but was assured that this would do the trick, especially since this powder had once been in the form of 10 whole pills prior to Hannah crushing them up, far more than would ever be used for a single dose. With that kind of dosage, I imagined any sedative would do the job. A few hours later, I was parked in the garage. Next to me sat 2 greasy paper bags and a cardboard carrier with 3 milkshakes. Under normal circumstances, one of the bags would have been opened and half the fries gone, but that night they sat untouched. What little I had eaten during lunch had all come up a few hours later, and the thought of eating anything sickened me. Inside the bags were 3 burgers, each wrapped in foil and held together by a label to identify contents. I had the bacon jalapeno burger, Hannah had the chicken sandwich, and Sarah had her favourite bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles. The sticker had made things a bit more difficult than I'd hoped, but with patience I had been successful in peeling it back enough to slide the sandwich free and sprinkle about half the envelope's contents in the middle. The rest had gone into her chocolate shake. Of course, I couldn't think about these things though, as I sat in the garage, just about how rough work had been and wondering if I was coming down with something or if I just had acid reflux, which would give me an excuse later if I couldn't keep dinner down. I put on a smile and carried the food in as I walked through the door. Hannah met me at the door, kissed my cheek, and thanked me for picking up dinner. Hannah set the table and began dividing up the contents of the bags while I approached Sarah's bedroom. I rapped on the door 3 times, as always. "Hey hun, dinner's here," I said. Nothing but silence answered me. I had been expecting this. Sarah seldom joined us for meals anymore. For weeks, we really only ever saw her, just before and just after school, as she made a beeline between her bedroom and the front door. Every other moment was spent locked in her room, presumably reading. I hadn't allowed myself to think for a moment Sarah was doing anything else, for fear I might be right. What I hadn't been expecting was the sound of the door opening behind me as I turned and started back towards the kitchen, resigned to leave her food in front of her bedroom door, like always. Silhouetted in the darkness, Sarah's bedroom light was never on, stood my daughter. She looked thin, pale, and her hair hung in thick, greasy ropes. She looked like nothing but an empty husk now, and for a brief moment, I felt better about what would soon transpire. The thing in Sarah's body wasn't my daughter. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Hey kiddo," I said. "Glad you decided to join us. I got your favourite, complete with a chocolate shake, 'cause I don't know about you, but I've had a hell of a week." Sarah didn't respond with more than an empty stare. We ate in the most poignant silence of my life. Sarah didn't look up at either of us, just ate the food in front of her, with her head hovering closely over the plate. I wasn't sure when the last time I saw her eat was, but watching it now gave me chills. God, she ate like an animal. Her head snapped up at me as that thought slipped through the cracks in my mind. Grease and salt and condiments were smeared across her face and hands. Hatred shot from her eyes like bullets. "Do you want a napkin?" I asked, attempting to sound casual but knowing I had failed, even as the words came out. I was staring into the face of a hideous beast. The longer she stared at me, the less human she seemed. Her pupils had completely overtaken the irises, leaving nothing but black pools of tar amidst a sea of white. Her jaw jutted forward a bit in an unnatural way, and it wasn't until she smiled at me that I understood why. Her teeth were flat and shallow, from months of being constantly ground together. The teeth alone were enough to send chills down my spine, but the way her mouth worked as she smiled, the muscles in her cheeks and jaw tightening, the veins in her neck and forehead pushing against her skin, like worms below the surface, that was enough to make me want to run. I passed her a napkin, tapped the corner of my mouth to show her where she needed to wipe the ketchup from, and returned to finish my meal. The moment her food was gone, Sarah returned to her bedroom. Hannah and I exchanged the quickest of looks, then began to clean up. I had read that midazolam takes somewhere around a half hour to take effect, but we elected to give it an hour. As the hour passed, the strangest feeling of calm began to slowly trickle into the house. It was so foreign to me that I'd wondered for a moment if I'd eaten the wrong burger and was now feeling the sedative take effect, but knew in an instant that wasn't possible. The calm we were feeling wasn't calm at all. Not really, but the sense of danger being lifted from the house. We'd spent so many years under this dark blanket of doom and depression and fear that I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel safe in my own home. It would seem that the drug had done its job. At the very minute the hour passed, Hannah and I were knocking at Sarah's door. "Sarah?" I called. No answer. Not that there would have been one anyway, but this time there was no shuffling sound, no footsteps, nothing at all. I clenched my jaw, met Hannah's hopeful and horrified gaze, then opened the door. Our daughter sat on the floor, leaning limply against the wall. I thought about turning the light on, but thought better of it. It was best I saw as little as possible. In her lap sat the open shoebox Hannah had discovered, and between her lifeless fingers was the orange tail of a cat. It looked fresh. I knelt down and called her name again. "Sarah! Sarah, can you hear me? It's your dad." Nothing. I felt her neck for a pulse. Nothing. Finally, Hannah retrieved a stethoscope Tammy had lent her, and I used it to listen for a heartbeat. We needed to be sure. I stood up and sighed, and with that sigh came over a decade's worth of tears. Tears for the pets Sarah had taken, tears for the families Sarah had ruined, and mostly tears for the little girl who had once brought me my oil filter wrench when she heard in my mind that I needed it. The little girl who had so much potential, who had been born into a world that would shun her and fear her and hate her for what she could do. None of this had been her fault, but she had to bear it nonetheless. It wasn't fair. It had never been fair. I sobbed for a long time, holding my daughter's body in an embrace I hadn't dared while her heart still beat. Hannah sat next to me, sobbing into the nape of my neck. We cried until the wells ran dry, and there were no more tears left to express the depression, fear, regret and relief we felt. The wells would fill again though, and the tears would be bark, but it was best that they had left us at least for the next few hours. We still had work to do. Hannah carried Sarah into the car. She was disturbingly light, and I went to work on the window frame with a crowbar from the shed. Once I'd gotten the window pried open, I cleaned the wooden paint from the end of the crowbar and returned it to the shed. Behind me, Bob's grave face watched from the window. He met my eye as I went back to examine my handiwork, and I gave him the slightest nod of confirmation. He wiped a palm across his face, presumably to catch a falling tear, then closed the curtain. Hannah was already waiting in the car. Behind her, buckled in with a blanket draped across her lap, sat Sarah's lifeless body. This had been something we thought about at length, and had been the topic of conversation several times when we found ourselves able to actually speak plainly without fear of Sarah overhearing. We had no idea how the medication would affect Sarah, nor did we know if killing her was even possible, so Hannah had the idea of buckling Sarah in the back seat. If she suddenly woke up, we would have a better story to tell her than if she awoke in a locked trunk. We drove in silence for 2 hours, passing the red trailer truck stop along the way, before we reached a point where roads became trails, then another hour as we forged our own trail through the desert. We drove until we finally found what we had been looking for, a distant mine shaft that hadn't been used in nearly half a century after a cave-in took the lives of a dozen men. This wasn't the main shaft that usually saw its fair share of graffiti artists or ghost hunters, but one on the other side of the former compound that was seldom used because of how small it was. This was only large enough to shuttle equipment from the mine to the surface, but if a person was small enough, they could slide themselves down and never see daylight again. We hiked the distance from the car to the mineshaft, taking turns carrying Sarah in our arms and passing her back and forth as we climbed the few chain-link fences marked with no trespassing signs. When we arrived, I took a final moment to say goodbye to Sarah and to tell her how sorry I was for everything that had happened to her. Hannah had already begun crying again, but was able to choke out a heartfelt, "Goodbye, baby girl. I'll always love you." I kissed Sarah on the forehead. Hannah did the same, and with that, we bid farewell to our little girl forever. Or so we thought. The news of Bob's death weighed heavily on my mind since I first learned of it. Equally as heavy was the news of Tamara, Tammy Howell, that I learned of a few days later. I recognised several of the other names in the news, including Mark Jarvis, Preston's father, Lawrence Marshall, Sarah's former moth teacher, and Evelyn Gates, the mother of a girl who had suffered 2 broken legs after she stuck gum in Sarah's hair during lunch. If there was any doubt that Sarah was involved in these deaths, it was dashed last night. Hannah and I had just sat down to dinner when there was a knock at the door. I stood from where I sat at the table, wondering who it could be, while Hannah sat quietly in the kitchen. Sarah was in her room where she'd been for most of the afternoon, a plate of food just outside her bedroom door. I opened the front door and saw the nervous face of David Peterson, my neighbour from across the street. He was a slight man, not elderly but approaching his twilight years, who had made a living the past 2 decades as a business accountant. Complete with thick-rimmed glasses and a pen in his breast pocket, Dave couldn't look the part better if he tried. "Hey, Dave," I said, a bit bemused. "Everything all right?" "I actually came over to ask you that," he answered. There was a tremble in his voice I'd never heard before. "Sure. What's going on?" He swallowed, searching for the right words. "Well, I've been meaning to come over and make sure you and Hannah were doing all right." He held up a plate of brownies I hadn't noticed until just then. "Nancy made these for you. Thought it might help with whatever you're going through." I frowned. "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." He held up a hand apologetically. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to pry. We've just seen you and Hannah a bit less than usual, and when we do see you, we can see there's something troubling you. We've tried to wave a few times, but I think you've been too wound up in your own world to notice, which is just fine," he added quickly. "We didn't take any offence. We just wanted to let you know we're here for you both if ever the need arises." I was touched, nearly to the point of tears. "Thank you, Dave," I told him. "That's very kind." I took the plate and was just about to shut the door when he stopped me. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," he said in a low, conspiratory voice. Behind me, I heard the faintest creak of a door opening in the hallway. I matched Dave's low tone. "What is it?" "This is going to sound a bit crazy, so please know that I wouldn't say this if I hadn't seen it for myself, but sometimes Nancy and I think we can see a woman standing in your upstairs window." I could feel the moisture leave my throat. "I'm sorry." "I don't think it's Hannah. This woman is rail thin, very unhealthy. You don't have anyone else living here, do you?" I shook my head. "No." "I was afraid of that," Dave said. He looked around, feeling the same sense of growing danger that I felt. "Now, here's the crazy part, and please know this comes from a place of love for you and your wife, but I don't think that woman we've seen in your window is human. She doesn't seem right." It was then that Dave's neck snapped, tilting in an unnatural, jagged angle, and the plate of brownies fell to the pavement and shattered. I heard nothing at first, just the fast beating of my heart and the high-pitched hum of blood in my ears. Then, all at once, I heard the screaming. It came in stereo, from both behind me and from across the street. Nancy Peterson had watched this scene from her doorstep, and Hannah, it seemed, from behind me. I slammed the door shut and whirled around. Hannah had indeed been standing behind me, and behind her, wearing the same Cheshire grin I'd seen the second night she'd stayed with us, stood Sarah. Her hair fell in her face in twisted knots, and although her mouth was shaped in a crescent moon of lunatic joy, her eyes were that of a corpse. "He shouldn't have thought those things," Sarah said tonelessly. "They always think those things." Hannah continued screaming, her arms and hands shaking. She looked at Sarah, then at me, and that look told me far more than it should have. It told me she was helplessly remembering that night, and every night leading up to it, which would be her demise. The screaming stopped abruptly, or at least the sound had. Hannah's throat still flexed, and her veins still stood out of her neck, but no sound escaped her throat. "Sarah," I began, but I suddenly lost my own voice as well, and all I could choke out was a dry wheeze. "She was never as good at the game as you were, was she?" Sarah asked me with the same toneless voice. "She would sing songs, trying to keep me out, but eventually her thoughts would trickle through, and her dreams." "What are you talking about?" I thought to Sarah, still unable to speak, but knowing she could hear me. "Don't pretend, Daddy. She told you everything. She poisoned my food that night, dumped me in the desert and left me to rot, and told everyone that I'd simply gone missing. Everyone but you, that is. You helped her do it. You helped her carry me to the desert and leave me there to rot." Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment her hold on Hannah's throat waned, and my wife was allowed a final ear-splitting cry. Then she was gone. Just like Preston Jarvis, Hannah, my wife and Sarah's mother, had been erased from existence. I fell to my knees and began to sob. Sarah approached me slowly, then knelt down and pressed her lips to my ear. Her breath was hot and putrid, the scent of rotting meat that I would later find in the form of a half-eaten bird in her bedroom. I won't take her away for you, like I did Preston's parents. You don't deserve that. Instead, I'll leave her in your mind, but only just enough to know you've forgotten. I looked up and met her eyes for the last time, seeing nothing but 2 black, hateful pupils, and then Sarah was gone as well, and I was alone. I didn't allow myself to think about it then, and I wouldn't allow myself until long after the feeling of dread had been lifted from the house. But when it had, I felt a wave of regret and love crash into me, like a freight train. My wife hadn't been able to keep Sarah out, and she'd known it. She couldn't keep Sarah from finding out the truth, but she could keep her from finding out the whole truth. She'd twisted things around enough to give me a chance for mercy, to allow Sarah to believe that Hannah had been the instigator and had only involved me after it was too late, which I know I don't deserve. The police did come eventually to collect Dave's body from my porch. A passing jogger had seen a corpse lying on my porch and had called 911. Even though his wife had seen what happened, had screamed his name as he fell to the ground. She told the police the last thing she remembered was having her husband take brownies over to the neighbours, and that she'd been unaware of the fact that he lay dead in plain view right across the street. I'm inclined to believe her story, because I've seen what Sarah can do, and perhaps that's Sarah's way of granting mercy. With every breath I take, I can feel a little more of my wife's memory slip away. I know it's still there, somewhere deep in my mind, but trying to recall things about her is becoming harder and harder, like trying to recall a dream after waking up. The features of her face are becoming distorted, blurry, and the memories we shared, our first kiss, our first date, our wedding night, are being blanketed by a haze I know will never be lifted. Sarah isn't gone, not like the others. I can still feel her presence, however distant, and I know it's only a matter of time until she returns home again. So, if you find yourself suddenly unable to recall the face of a loved one, if you feel a prickling sensation on the nape of your neck while you sit alone in your bedroom, if you find yourself awake in the middle of the night with a sense of dread hanging over you, know that it may be Sarah, and keep your thoughts guarded. She will be listening.